On the night of the 3rd of August 2015, baby E suffered a gastrointestinal bleed, collapsed, and sadly died in the early hours of the following morning. Baby E's mother had visited the neonatal unit earlier that evening and was disturbed to find her son crying loudly and with blood around his mouth. This was at just before 9 p.m., she told the court. It was alleged by the prosecution that Lucy Letby had deliberately inflicted trauma on baby E and caused him to bleed. They also accused her of falsifying medical notes. She had documented the mother's visit at approximately 10 p.m. and had also noted the first signs of bleeding at around the same time. But this was contradicted by baby E's mother, who testified that she had visited and seen bleeding just before 9. In the absence of any other evidence, this was key to the murder charge, as the prosecution made plain. Why else would Letby lie about the time if not to cover her tracks? But does this stand up to scrutiny? In this video, we will demonstrate that the prosecution's version of events is incompatible with contemporaneous records and agreed witness evidence. We'll begin by looking at Mother E's timeline of events. She testified that she went to the neonatal unit just before 9 p.m. to deliver breast milk. She recalled hearing her baby crying and seeing blood around his mouth. Alarmed, she returned to the maternity ward and phoned her husband. That phone call was logged at 9:11 p.m., a timestamp that would later be used to support her recollection of events and thereby the case against Lucy Letby. From the Chester Standard live trial reporting, I knew I needed to speak to him and tell him. The court hears the telephone records, including timings, were obtained. The call to her husband was made at 9:11 p.m. and lasted 4 minutes and 25 seconds. She said she rang her husband about her concerns, and she remained on the postnatal ward. Later, midwife Susan Brooks came to tell her that she had been called by neonatal unit staff and had been informed that baby E had deteriorated and required intubation. She again contacted her husband. The midwife spoke to him and urged him to come to the hospital straight away. He was at home about an hour's drive away. The Chester Standard. She was later told by the midwife and to ring her husband. The midwife called the husband at 10:52 p.m., telling him to come to the hospital after the neonatal rang the maternity ward. Mother E's phone call log was provided to the court as evidence that the two calls were made at 9:11 p.m. and 10:52 p.m. We can see that the sequence of events she described is as follows. Firstly, someone from the neonatal unit rang the maternity ward. Next, the midwife came to inform her about baby E's deterioration and asked her to ring her husband. Then the midwife spoke to him on the phone and told him to come to the hospital. This is an extract from Mother E's testimony at the Thirlwall Inquiry. Question: when you went back, did you get a call later that night to go back to the NNU? Answer: yes. So I'd had a conversation with a midwife, and I was upset, and I told her what I'd found, and I think she checked on me throughout the couple of hours, and she then asked me to, she'd come into the room and asked me to contact my husband and ring him. And at that point I knew something really bad was happening, and she asked to speak to him, and she didn't, she wanted to speak to him, and she told him to come to the hospital straight away and not to drive, to get somebody else to drive him. Subsequently, the midwife Susan Brooks escorted Mother E to the neonatal unit, where they waited in a corridor. From there, the mother could see a medical team working around her son's incubator. Continuing Mother E's testimony. Question: so you go down with the midwife again that evening? Answer: yes. Question: How long after when you first went down are we talking about? Do you remember the timings or not? Answer: a couple of hours. About 2 hours, I think. We note here that Mother E attested to a time span of about 2 hours between the first and second visit to the neonatal unit. We'll come back to this later. Continuing on. Question: where were you when you went down? Where were you taken? Answer: so, when I went down, I was sat in that same corridor where I could first hear them crying, and there were some chairs, and the midwife was sat next to me. I couldn't see Child E, but I could see the team around him working, and it looked busy, and it looked serious. Although the time of her later arrival to the NNU wasn't specified in court, she was clear that it was while baby E's resuscitation effort was underway. From her evidence, we can be sure that this next visit was after 11:40 p.m., which, as we will see shortly, was when the serious desaturation and collapse occurred. This is consistent with midwife Susan Brooks's statement in agreed evidence. As reported by the Chester Standard, at midnight, the midwife stayed with Child E's mother for 10 minutes in the corridor outside the neonatal nursery room, where Child E and Child F were. So, in our timeline for Mother E, we now have her later visit to the NNU at midnight. We will now review the testimony given by doctors and their clinical notes. Dr. Harkness, the registrar on duty, noted his first visit to baby E at 10 p.m., responding to a report of flecks of blood in the baby's vomit. The Chester Standard reported on his trial testimony. He says for this night he was called over at 10 p.m., having been called over because Child E had blood in his vomit. Small amounts of blood, minuscule blood flecks, were spotted when the nasogastric tube was brought out of Child E, he recalls. The court is now shown the 10:10 p.m. note. He notes Child E's blood pressure was very good, a CRT reading was good, the heart rate was normal, and saturation rates were good with minimal oxygen support. At that point in time, everything is fine except for the blood in the aspirate, he tells the court. Child E was also pink, well perfused, the lungs were clear, the abdomen was soft, not distended. He was called back to the room at 11 p.m. after a more severe bleed had occurred. The situation was now a lot more serious, and baby E needed greater oxygen support, though he was still conscious, awake, and crying. The Chester Standard again. For the 11 p.m. note, he says Letby called him into room 1, where further GI blood loss and desaturation to 70% is noted. Dr. Harkness says the child is still well enough to be awake enough and conscious to cry. He says he is planning to intubate Child E and do an X-ray to check Child E's lungs and abdomen to try and explain why the baby was deteriorating. The type of intubation was elective, which was not on the level of an emergency situation, the court hears. It was this event at 11 p.m. which led to the decision to intubate and the need to contact his parents. But before the elective intubation could be completed, at 11:40 p.m., baby E's condition again deteriorated, this time dramatically. It was now an emergency situation, and a crash call was put out. Baby E required urgent resuscitation. Continuing Dr. Harkness's testimony, the Chester Standard reported. He records sudden deterioration at 11:40 p.m. Dr. Harkness tells the court he was in the room when the sudden deterioration happened and was there with Lucy Letby and another nurse. Those nurses would have been gathering the drugs to be administered. Dr. Christopher Wood responded straight away to the crash call, as he was nearby. The Chester Standard reported. Dr. Wood made a note of staff present during resuscitation. It was a team of 6, including himself, Dr. Harkness, a further doctor, and 3 senior nurses including Lucy Letby. This scenario reflects that same situation that Mother E described when she arrived at the NNU, and is further confirmation that her second visit was after the 11:40 p.m. emergency began. We will now look at the timeline as recorded by the midwife Susan Brooks. Her statement was accepted as agreed evidence and was read out in court. From the Chester Standard. A statement by Susan Brooks is read out, dated April 2, 2019. She was a registered midwife at the Countess of Chester Hospital in August 2015. Her midwife notes are presented to the court, showing the mum of child E was postnatal well, and one of the twins had deteriorated slightly. At 11:30 p.m. on August 3rd, she had a call from the neonatal unit to ask child E's mother to go down in 30 minutes, as child E had a bleed and required intubating, very poorly. She said the mum was very upset and she thought the 30 minutes was unreasonable and asked to go sooner. At midnight, the midwife stayed with child E's mother for 10 minutes in the corridor outside the neonatal nursery room, where child E and child F were. And the mum was eventually allowed in once medical staff had stabilized child E. Two key discrepancies emerge. Firstly, the midwife's statement, agreed evidence, says that she was informed of baby E's deterioration by the neonatal unit at 11:30 p.m. This was the reason she went to speak to Mother E and why they phoned her husband to ask him to come to the hospital. But the telephone call to Father E was purportedly made at 10:52 p.m., 38 minutes earlier. How is this possible? Mother E also confirmed in court that it was only after being contacted by the NNU that the midwife came to see her in her room. Secondly, there is an unexplained gap between the 10:52 p.m. phone call and the mother's arrival in the neonatal unit at midnight. We know from the midwife's statement that the neonatal staff initially asked her to wait 30 minutes before bringing the mother, but that the mother was distressed and insisted on going sooner. And her testimony doesn't suggest any delay after the 10:52 p.m. call. As we have seen before, the Chester Standard, reporting on the midwife's statement, said, she said the mum was very upset and she thought the 30 minutes was unreasonable and asked to go sooner. Yet, in this version of the timeline, we have her arriving about an hour later. Also, it gives us a time span of 3 hours between the first and second visit, whereas Mother E attested to it being about 2 hours. There is also the medical evidence to consider. At 10:10 p.m., Dr. Harkness recorded that baby E was pink, well perfused, with clear lungs and a soft, non-distended abdomen. He concluded that, aside from blood in the aspirate, everything was fine. If an attack on baby E had occurred before 9 p.m., as the prosecution alleged, there was certainly no systemic indication of it over an hour later. So, how can we reconcile these discrepancies? Mother E's certainty rests heavily on her phone records, which she obtained from her mobile provider in late April or May 2017. Earlier, in February 2017, Ian Harvey, the Countess of Chester's medical director, had written to her and informed her about the increased mortality at the hospital. Among the cases under review was the death of her own child, baby E. This was all prior to the police becoming involved. Over the weeks that followed, Ian Harvey wrote several more times to keep her updated about the ongoing investigations. Then, accompanying a letter dated April 28, 2017, he enclosed baby E's medical notes. It was in the wake of this correspondence that Mother E was prompted to request her phone records from her mobile provider. In her Thirlwall Inquiry testimony, she described how this came about. Question. Tell us why you challenged the timings, and why you say at the time you thought it was sloppy. Answer. So I challenged the timings because it stated that on the 3rd of the 8th, child E had a gastro bleed at 22:10, when in fact I know that that was an hour earlier. Question. You knew he was bleeding an hour earlier? Answer. I knew he was bleeding just before 9 o'clock and I pointed that out. And that was the time that I was that furious I contacted my mobile phone provider. Because I knew that I'd had a conversation with my husband as soon as I'd come back up. And I almost thought that I was losing my mind and I was wrong. So I wanted that proof that I was right. And I got that proof. I was right. And I knew what time it was. Question. So the time here had been incorrectly stated in the records? Answer. Yes. Question. So when you read that letter from Mr. Harvey and saw those 2 pages, what do you think was happening then? This was in April 2017. Answer. I thought that the hospital was really incompetent. That was my overarching thought. I just thought that they just haven't been able to get anything right. Nearly 2 years had passed since the calls in question, before Mother E requested the phone records. To explain the timeline discrepancies, we suggest that there is every likelihood that those records were time-stamped in UTC rather than British Summer Time, which was in effect on that date in August 2015. UTC, Coordinated Universal Time, is effectively the same as GMT and runs 1 hour behind British Summer Time. And while phone bills typically convert call logs to local time, this wasn't a standard bill. It was a call record, extracted long after the provider's 12-month legally required retention period had passed. If the call logs were indeed in UTC, then what had been taken as a 9:11 p.m. call was, in fact, made at 10:11 p.m., and the 10:52 p.m. call actually placed at 11:52 p.m. This would explain how the prosecution's timeline, backed up by the unadjusted call logs, is out of sync with the midwife's testimony and the recorded medical events of that night. Did Cheshire Police ever verify the phone record? There is nothing in the public record to indicate that they did, which would be a huge oversight. Let's now adjust Mother E's phone call times by 1 hour and test this out. The 10:52 p.m. call to Father E shifts forwards to 11:52 p.m. This adjustment places it shortly after the 11:30 p.m. call from the neonatal unit. It was on this call that the midwife was first notified of baby E's deterioration and the need for intubation. Following the phone call to her husband, Mother E and the midwife arrive at the neonatal unit at midnight. There is no unexplained delay in getting there. The 9:11 p.m. phone call now moves to 10:11 p.m. That call was made immediately after Mother E's visit to the neonatal unit, meaning that she must have arrived there at 10 p.m. rather than at 9. We now have the correct gap of about 2 hours between visits, just as Mother E attested. The adjusted timeline also aligns with the clinical note written by Lucy Letby documenting Mother E's visit at 10 p.m. The prosecution alleged that this was a lie. However, it's clear from the revised timeline that the time she recorded in the notes was accurate. Under the revised timeline, the prosecution have no basis upon which to assert that Lucy Letby falsified medical records. Furthermore, the allegation that she inflicted harm on baby E can no longer be sustained. In this corrected sequence of events, Mother E's timeline is now consistent with the midwife's agreed evidence, clinical records, and the accounts given by Dr. Harkness and Dr. Wood. To borrow Nick Johnson's metaphor, all the bits of the jigsaw puzzle fit, and they only fit one way. But in our timeline, the pieces fit properly to make a complete and consistent picture. In contrast, The prosecution's jigsaw puzzle has missing pieces, and other pieces are out of place. Was Prosecutor Nick Johnson KC aware of these timeline discrepancies? Turning to his closing speech, he said this: "Do you remember being told that a message had come up from the labor ward, and the mother of babies E and F was so upset by what she heard that she asked a midwife to use her phone to phone the father of babies E and F? This is incorrect according to Mother E's own testimony, where she said it was the midwife who asked her to call her husband. It's also worth noting that the prosecutor makes no specific reference to the midwife, Susan Brooks, or her agreed evidence, despite the fact that she played an active part in the events he's describing." He continues, "Just park that time in your head if you would, 22:52, and go to tile 128. Click on that please and scroll down, just before 2300 hours. Here is Dr. Harkness's note. He times it at 2300 hours. Obviously, he's not using a stopwatch. Here he's pointing to the 11 p.m. event, the trigger for Mother E to be contacted, but he appears to be suggesting that there's some doubt about its actual timing. He obviously knows that the phone call to Father E should follow on from this in the timeline. He goes on to say, "This is the beginning of the final dramatic collapse of baby E, and it coincides, doesn't it, with that telephone call made by the midwife to the father of baby E? No, it doesn't coincide. The 11 p.m. desaturation event and what followed does not coincide with the 10:52 p.m. phone call 8 minutes earlier. Add in the 11:30 p.m. call from the NNU to the midwife, in reality occurring before the phone call to Father E, and the distortion becomes even greater. In his version of events, we see the midwife speaking to Father E at 10:52 p.m. about baby E's deterioration, 38 minutes before she herself was informed about it at 11:30 p.m. We see a long delay of more than an hour before Mother E arrived at the NNU, when we know that she was very anxious to get there and had objected to the requested 30-minute wait. In our adjusted timeline, we see the midwife being contacted by the neonatal unit at 11:30 p.m. It's been half an hour since baby E's gastric bleed occurred. Enough time for Dr. Harkness to have discussions with senior colleagues and begin preparations for treatment. After the midwife is contacted at 11:30 p.m., she goes to see Mother E in her room and informs her of the situation. They call Father E at 11:52 p.m. and the midwife asks him to come to the hospital. They go to the NNU straight away and arrive 8 minutes later, at midnight. So, did the prosecution know about the issues with their timeline? We suggest that they did. Of course, we can't prove that the call logs were an hour behind, but when you consider the midwife's evidence, which the prosecution accepted, it's clear the timings just don't stack up. You can't have the midwife being notified about baby E's deterioration at 11:30 p.m. and then apparently travelling back in time to speak to Father E about it at 10:52 p.m. However, by putting the call times an hour forward, everything then aligns. There's no reason to doubt that Mother E did see what looked like traces of dried blood around her baby's mouth, and that she did see him crying. But as we have demonstrated, by the time she arrived at the neonatal unit, blood had been seen in baby E's vomit. It was 10 p.m. The registrar had already been called, and he was on his way. There was no attempted cover-up by Lucy Letby. The prosecution have built their case on a false premise. In reality, there is no evidence that Lucy Letby waited before calling the doctor, no evidence that she falsified medical notes, and no evidence that she harmed baby E. Her conviction on this murder charge was based on a fallacy, and it should be overturned. To those who support the prosecution's version of events, We pose this question. How do you explain the discrepancy in timings between these two events? The 11:30 p.m. call from the neonatal unit to the midwife, and then the subsequent phone call to Father E, impossibly timed at 10:52 p.m., according to the prosecution.